everyone. I hope you're able to hear and see me now. I think we just had a little issue with the stream. Um, just give me 1 second while I confirm if you can hear me or see me. If you can you please pop it up as a question? I've seen questions come through, and thank you for that. Okay, it's working now. Perfect. Thank you so much. Hi guys, welcome to our Richard III text analysis lecture. My name is Aditi. I apologize for the technical issue that we just encountered, but hopefully you're all able to hear and see me now. If you answered the polls already, thank you. We'll go through them again, but welcome to you all. Let's get started. So just a quick firstly, welcome once again from all of us here at ATA Notes. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're enjoying the holidays. I know they're coming to a close, but you know, we still got plenty of days to live to have some fun. So welcome. As you know, ATA Notes is an organization that's all about, you know, helping you guys out. So, well, thank you for coming to today's lecture and making the most of it. We also have lots of other free resources for you today, including that are available on our website, including a study notes. We've got hundreds of downloadable study resources. Our lectures are on this week, so definitely sign up for the relevant lectures. We also have discussion forums online that, you know, and it's got like a big English forum. We can talk English, we can talk text. Sorry. Along with that, we also have online videos, newsletters, ATA calculator, articles, and heaps more that you can make the most of today. Now, along with that, we also have some paid resources. So if you're looking for that extra little bit of push, we've got TuteSmart, which is our online tutoring resource. So I'm a tutor here at TuteSmart. I tutor English Advanced and PDH-PE. We also have our study guides. Sorry about that. We also have our study guides. Again, they're a great resource. You've got printed revision materials with top tips. They're sorted according to the syllabus. And then we've got a Netflix of the study guides. It's editor limited. It's a personal favorite of mine. I'll talk a lot more about it later on as well. But this is where you are able to access all our study materials, our study guides, and practice questions and text guides as well. And I've got some sweet deals here for you today, so stay tuned for that. Alright, now let us pop over to Slido. Hopefully it's all working fine now. So I'm just going to go back, and like I said, I apologize for the technological little mishap that we had, but so some of you have already voted, so we would just add how are we all feeling today? You know, we're getting close to school, so that's good, you know. I mean, it's good that you're getting close to school because you can get to it, finish it off, and then enjoy afterwards. But most of us are feeling pretty okay, which is good to hear. Now, this is a big one. How was term 1 of year 12? How do we feel? It most certainly is, you know, a push from year 11. It takes a bit of time to adjust to, but once you get to like the next 3 terms, you'll feel like you've always been a year 12. Like, I think that's just the feeling. It's like it becomes so natural. Okay, I've got Slido open on the side, so if you've got questions, you can start popping them up as well. Okay, awesome. So most of us are feeling pretty alright with it. I've got a 3 and 4. That's good. That's really good. That's good to hear. Now, firstly, now this is an important one. Are we studying Richard the Third and looking for Richard for Module A? So that way I can, like, you know, be more specific to Module A. If you're here just for Richard the Third, you just want to sort of know the text, that's all good. That's kind of cool, you know? If you're into Shakespeare and you're here just for the text, good on you. If you're here for looking for Richard and Richard III, good on you too, because you're gonna need it. Oh, so do you have someone who's just here to watch Richard III? That's nice. That's a bit of commitment. That's awesome. Okay, cool. But most of us here are for Module A. Yeah, totally get it. Now, Okay, have you read Richard III yet? So thank you for if you've already read it. Remember, this is anonymous. The words just allow me to have a good idea of where we are at. Allows me to gauge how you guys are going with everything. So do fill them out. Now, have you read Richard III yet? Okay. So most of us now haven't read it. That's all good. And I've got a plot summary in there for us, so that is not a problem at all. We're going to go through it, and hopefully after we go through it, you'll feel like, actually, this is a very interesting play. Let's go home and read it. Well, you're at home, so I don't know. I mean, perhaps you're in the library watching this, but you're like, I'm going to read it now. Okay, cool. So most of us haven't. That's all good. Some of us have. It's not like a huge ratio. Like, it's not a huge, like, disparity between the two. It's kind of like 50-50. Not a problem. Okay, now, finally, what are we hoping to sort of get out of this lecture? What would you sort of like me to focus on in terms of Richard III? Is it the play? Is it the plot? Is it the ideas? What do we think? What do we think is like the thing that we really need to work on with Richard? Quotes, okay, quotes plus techniques. The plot and context, absolutely what is important from Moray. Yes, I can focus on Moray. You can put up some specific questions on Slido as well for Moray. Because that way I'm able to, yeah, like focus a bit more on Moray, because this is a Richard III lecture, so I can't really draw out looking for Richard and Richard III, but I can focus on it and answer questions if you've got specific questions. I've got side open on the side, so if I keep looking this way, I'm looking out for the questions that are coming through. Crash course of the text, yep, that's what we're doing today, basically. Comparing the, yep, so if you've got questions about comparison to looking for Richard, um, I can, I will try my best to sort of draw out some things, but I will be focusing a lot more on Richard III, so so you can pop that up on Slido as a question that I can come to later on, and we can spend a lot more time there talking about looking for Richard and like Moray and stuff. But yeah, we're basically going through the text today, and yeah, going through the text today. Alright, so last one. What do we feel about Richard right now? And this, I guess, will kind of be like, just understanding the play, but I'd like to know what we are all thinking. Like, especially if you have read the text, what do you think? If you haven't, that's all good too, like I said. But if you have read the text, what's like the most annoying bit right now that concerns you? I think personally, for me, it was always just like remembering the characters and just knowing like who's there, what's happening. That can always be a bit to sort of wrap your head around. But once you do, the language always also, definitely becomes a bit of a barrier. But you sort of get to the gist of it the more you read. Yeah, he's the villain. Okay, so I assume you find that interesting that he's the villain. Um, Understanding the language, complexity with context. Yep, there's a lot of contextual stuff going on. Yes. There is like a word limit, so don't worry if like your spelling is like being cut off and you have to like shortcut it. That's all good. Essay writing, yes, essay writing is big here too. Context, we'll be focusing on the context. Why is it known to be hard? It's not known to be hard. I'm just well, yeah, it's not known to be hard, but I think with all Shakespearean plays, there's like that inherent complexity with the characters and the plot and the language. So you'd sort of find that characters, yes, political, social context, yeah. The context is really fun, and you'll find that as we get into it. Awesome. So that's it for now. We'll come back here and talk a bit more, but for now, let's jump right back into. Okay, I don't know what Norton wants. But anyways, let's jump right back into what we have planned for today in terms of getting into it. So before we get into that, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Aditi. I think I said that in like the first stream where you weren't able to hear me, but I'm sorry I forgot this time. My name is Aditi. I graduated last year. No, not last year. That's just a bit of a habit. It just doesn't feel like it's been almost 2 years now. Like it's a bit of something that I need to get used to. So do mind that. So don't mind that. So graduated in 2021 as the Ducks. With an ADA of 95. I've got band sixes in English Extension, Advanced, PD, and Biology, and I currently tutor English Advanced and PDHPE. I am studying a Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Advanced Studies at University of Sydney, majoring in medical science and political economy. Generally, I love reading, huge English nerd, good shows and sunny days. And luckily, because I'm overseas right now, it's a very sunny day here. I hope you guys are all enjoying the nice sunny weather too, but it's like really cold where I am. So, yeah, a bit jealous right now, but that's all good. So, let's get into our game plan for today. What are we going to do? Hopefully, this encompasses all that we wanted to get through today. So, we've got the context. We'll talk a lot about the context. There's a lot coming your way. Like, not a bad lot though, like a good, good understanding of the context. Don't want to scare you off. We've got the plot. We will be interpreting the play. We will be talking about, apologies for the missing A in character, but we'll be looking at character analysis and themes of the play as well. Again, I'm more than happy to answer any looking for Richard III, like comparison module A questions at the end. So please ask those through Slido if you want me to really focus on that. We'll most certainly come to that. Okay, now Richard III is all about context. Like, I think it's one of those, like, obviously context is important in all Shakespearean plays, right? Like, you need to have a good understanding of context in terms of, like, what's happening in the Elizabethan society, what's happening with, what's happening in the Elizabethan society, what's happening with, the divine right of kings, the social structure, all of that. But here, context is, like, very juicy. Like, it's so interesting, and it sort of gets personal to Queen Elizabeth too. So it's quite interesting to sort of know. Remember, Richard III is a classic Shakespearean play. It adheres to those Elizabethan theocratic values and the doctrines of like the divine right of kings and great chain of beings. So we've seen this, obviously in his other plays too. Hamlet, Macbeth, you name it, it's there. But here, the context, like the personal context, is so interesting. However, remember, there is more to context here than most Shakespearean plays, which does make it a lot of fun. So, Richard III is one of Shakespeare's history plays. It's a historical play. You'd assume it's right. It's history, right? He's telling us what happened in history. And we're supposed to trust him because he is a great author. He is, a canonical author. He's, like, he is so reputed, So, we sort of think that it's based on a real-life historical figure amongst the background of the medieval English history. However, Shakespeare's plays are not historically accurate because Shakespeare is a human who has his own motives behind his work. So, Richard III here is no exception. Now, this really excites me. Like, I love this. But, like, I love the context behind Richard III, so I'm so excited for this. But, anyways, things are dramatized here to create interest and to appeal to you. Like, he wants people to not like Richard. That's why Richard is the villain from the get-go. You don't really see that, with many of his plays, right? But here, you see it from the get-go. "'Tis is the winter of our discontent." It's there, like, he does not want this man to be liked. That's like the whole point from the very beginning. You're supposed to be like, okay, that is an evil guy. And think of this from the viewpoint of, the Elizabethan audience. They can see he's a guy with bad intentions, and so they're not gonna like him. They'll be throwing tomatoes at him at from the mock pits and stuff, and they used to do that. So that's why Shakespeare's characterized him like that. But without jumping ahead of myself, which I do tend to do, let's just focus on the fact that it's dramatized to create interest. And by studying how Shakespeare has molded these historical events and people, to suit the preferences of his audience, and to suit his personal context and, his own motives, we can also gain an understanding of the prejudices that have pervaded society and also the general public at the time, and vice versa. So the audience impacts the text, but the text also impacts the audience. There's that relationship going on between the two. So Richard III, to simply put it, is a work of propaganda. It's a propagandist play. Now, what does that mean? How does that work out? Well, we will discuss this a lot more in depth, I promise you, because I love talking about it. But basically, Shakespeare wrote Richard III during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Tudor monarch. And she belonged to the House of Tudor, which came into power when Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry, when Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry VII, succeeded Richard III as the King of England after he defeated Richard in a battle. So basically, if that was a bit of a mouthful, so basically, Queen Elizabeth, her grandfather defeated Richard III and became the King of England. How? So, think of it this way. Was Shakespeare going to displease his monarch, the person who's funding his theatre, who's promoting him as a storyteller? Was he going to displease her by making her family, by making her grandfather and her legitimacy as a queen look questionable, right? And make her look bad for seizing the throne from Richard, who was on the throne. Like, think of it this way. Shakespeare in all his plays, talks about the divine right of kings, that the king is the rightful, the representative of God. You're not supposed to, usurp the king or the queen. You are supposed to respect that natural hierarchy. But when Queen Elizabeth's grandfather did that to Richard, they fought it out. He took over Richard's throne, that kind of went against what he's kind of said, right? So, but Shakespeare is smart. He's not going to displease his monarch. So he was like, instead of writing, and you can look at that break meme there, I think that paints it up quite nicely. Instead of writing an historically accurate, unbiased play, we are instead going to write a piece of propagandist work to please my monarch, to get more funding, to be cool, and to be liked. Because if the queen doesn't like you, there's high chance, the society ain't liking you either. So he makes the Yorks, and specifically Richard, look so Machiavellian, despite of no historical proof. You can kind of go into a rabbit hole here when you research this. There's no proof that Richard did, what Shakespeare has painted him to do. There's no proof of that. It's funny because even like the fact that Richard is a hunchback, even that is like dramatized so much by Shakespeare in history. Like they took out his grave and he's not that hunchback. Like it's very very slight, and so you can now start to see the way that Shakespeare was so smart, and he's just made you, when you read it for the first time without knowing this context, you hate Richard. He's a bad man. He is, he's not a good, nothing good's happening here. But once you get an insight into the context and you're like, whoa, look, wait a second, it's all false. He's painted Richard in the light. He's just, trying to please his monarch. It gets so exciting to sort of study. So now, instead, Shakespeare uses his play as a way to legitimize Queen Elizabeth's reign by promoting the Tudor myth. So let's focus on the Tudor myth, that Richard III was a murderous usurper who had wrongfully taken power. So remember, he's not going to now go against, the divine right of kings and stuff, divine right of kings, right chain of beings. So now he's saying that Henry VII is good, and he's known as Richmond in the play, and I'll refer to him as Richmond because it's easier than Henry VII every time. But Richmond, so he's not going to make it look like Richmond wrongfully took power from Richard III. Instead, he's going to make it look like Richard III wrongfully took power, and Richmond is the savior of society by taking back that power. And that, the Tudor dynasty instead were the bringers of peace and prosperity to England. You can see where this is going, right? You'll be able to see plenty of examples in the study which highlight this biased agenda. Like you'll see quotes where, it's like, God be with you, Richmond. And there's and I can't remember the exact quote, but it's at the end where they're battling it out. And you can see the way in which Shakespeare promotes Richmond, that God is on Richmond's side, that God knows that Richard is an evil Machiavellian dude, And that is, think of how important that would be for the Elizabethan audience to think that, okay, that's the good guy, that's the right guy, because God's on his side, because that's good. He's the right owner. Sorry, he's the right the owner of the throne. That he deserves it. So it's quite interesting to see that, and you do see it. Now, for example, again, Shakespeare physically describes Richard as a grotesque, deformed hunchback, but recent forensic evidence has debunked this. So Shakespeare was wrong. Study says Richard III was not a hunchback. Look at that. Like, that's, you can see what's happening here. Now, along with that, the play is full of inaccuracies. Like, the play, every angle of Richard's life is dramatized. It's like it's making him look like a Machiavellian ruler. So, out of the many crimes that are attributed to Richard within the play, it is now generally accepted that Richard was innocent of the majority of them. Look at that. I mean, and if you read the play, you totally know what I mean. I'll talk about the plot. So if you know the plot, and once I'll talk about it, you will definitely understand this a bit more. But Richard was innocent of majority of them. He wasn't the guy that Shakespeare painted him out to be, and we know now why he did that. Whilst the others cannot be proven conclusively. So, crimes versus myths. We've got all these myths that Richard was a hunchback with a withered arm. Richard murdered Edward Lancastrian, Prince of Wales. Richard murdered the deposed king. Richard contrived the execution of his brother. Richard forced Anne Neville into marriage and poisoned her. Richard, without just cause, usurped the throne from his nephew Edward V. Richard was a cruel tyrant. So it's quite interesting to see that those are all myths, and that's like what the whole play revolves around. Like, Richard murdered his brothers, his nephews, forcefully married Anne, and we'll get to that. But you can see what's happening here. Look here. So since Richard III sat on the throne of England, his reputation has been compromised by extreme, inaccurate, and sometimes entirely fictitious reports. Most problematically, they've often been accepted as true. That's because we trust Shakespeare as an audience, right? Because just generally think about it, like we trust him because he is a great writer, one of the most noted composers of Western literature. So there's that. Now, again, I can sort of keep talking about this, but let's now focus on another piece, very important piece of contextual information here, which is a War of Roses. So with the text, you see that the text starts after the war has ended, and then at the end of the text, there's another war in which Richard is defeated by Richmond, Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. So there's the Tudor myth. So that's the Tudor myth, right? What we just talked about, all of that is the Tudor myth. Now, you will also need to know about the War of Roses. The War of Roses is the popular name given to the civil conflict between the two rival branches, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, for the control of the English throne. Now, before I go ahead, I'm just going to paint one more thing for the Tudor myth now, is that, that I should have mentioned earlier, is that appearances dictating behavior and personality was also part of the Tudor myth, which is why Shakespeare makes Richard III, like, nature doesn't want him. So that part of the Tudor myth, that appearances dictate personality, is also, used by Shakespeare to portray Richard as a hunchback, as an evil Machiavellian man. But that's that. Now, moving on to the War of Roses. So yes, it's a rivalry between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Richard III takes place during this period of time, during the last stages of the War of Roses. The House of Lancaster is the Red Rose, and the House of York, to which Richard belonged, is the White Rose. Now, you don't have to know every single detail here, because this is English, it's Richard III, we don't have to know all the history, but the context, like mentioning the context, especially in Module A, where, remember, everything is based on context here, right? Module A is about that comparison. It's about, the comparison of why there are similarities and differences in text, why the two texts conversing with each other. So knowing the context, knowing about, how the War of Roses has fueled this is important, but you don't have to know all of this in like great detail. I'm going through it because I think it's interesting. It certainly helps helps you gain a better understanding of what's happening and why it's happening. So, I recommend brushing on the origins of the war and its aftermath, the players in the conflict, like who is a Lancaster, who is a York. We'll talk about it, but Richard's, and once you read, you'll know. But Richard's family are the Yorks, and Richmond's family are the Lancasters. The events that transpired, because it will make your study of like character motivations and the play in general, like I said, much easier. It also allows you to discern between fact and the fiction which Shakespeare has created, and it allows you to say, okay, you know what? There it is. That's what he did do. That's what he didn't do. So it's quite interesting. There is more details on the 8 notes text guide, but essentially, oh my goodness, essentially, here is a concise summary of the War of the Roses. So. And literally, this is all you need to know. So, conflicting claims for the throne occurred after the death of King Edward III, and the Lancasters and the Yorks, who originated from the same family. The Lancasters managed to have the throne for a while. You don't need to know how this happened. Again, long story. Don't worry about it. Sorry about that. King Henry IV, Lancaster, was persuaded to marry Margaret of Anjou as a political maneuver to gain French support. Now, however, corrupt rule by Margaret and her allies led to discontent amongst the people, and the increasing popularity of Richard IV's cousin, Richard of York. Now that's our Richard, Richard III. A civil war broke out until a Yorkist victory where Edward III, Richard of York's son, was crowned king. Now, however, Edward IV made a Edward IV, sorry. That's Edward IV. Sorry. Edward IV made a political mistake when he backed out of an arranged marriage with a French princess. Instead, he married the widow of a Lancastrian supporter, Elizabeth Woodville. This move was unpopular amongst his followers, and this alienated his chief supporter and advisor, the Earl of Warwick. Now, Warwick then allied with Lancasters and turned Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, against him. So you will see George in the text as well, and Richard kills George in the text. But not to confuse you with the text right now, just focus on the War of Roses. But anyways, their efforts bravely restored the previous king, King Henry VI, to the throne. But Edward IV managed to recapture the throne in 1471. Henry VI died in captivity afterwards, and his son Edward of Westminster was killed in battle. In the play, now think of the play here, this guy here who briefly is restored, his corpse makes an appearance, and Edward of Westminster, who's killed in the battle, is mentioned. Henry IV's daughter-in-law, Edward of Westminster's wife, Anne Neville, appears, and Richard marries Anne in the novel. And in the novel, Henry IV's wife, Margaret of Anjou, also appears, but this is historically incorrect. Like, that's not right. The rest of Edward IV's reign was peaceful, but conflict resumed after his death in 1483. And this is around the point where the events of the play begin. Although his 12-year-old son, Richard V, was in line to succeed him as a king, Richard's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared that Edward's children were illegitimate due to Edward's secret invalid marriage to Elizabeth, and subsequently they were unable to succeed him as king. Instead, Richard ascended to the throne as Richard III. So Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is Richard III. That can always be confusing, but remember, Richard is the Duke of Gloucester, and George is the Duke of Clarence. Now, however, Richard's reign was cut short by Henry Tudor, Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry, Elizabeth's grandfather, descended from the Lancasters who bolstered support from his royal claim and raised an army in France. Henry Tudor crossed the English Channel in 1485 and defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He then ascended the throne as Henry VII and married Edward III's daughter Elizabeth of York to cement his claim by uniting Lancaster and York together. So this is actually what happens, like the actual context, the history. Yes, yes, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, gets Edward's throne, but not by killing his children, rather by declaring that his children were illegitimate. I mean, you can argue, I mean, that's just as bad, but it's better than Shakespeare portraying him that he killed the kids. But yeah, that's the actual what has happened. Now we'll get to what Shakespeare shows in a second too, but let's just continue focusing on the War of Roses. This ended the War of Roses and it started the Tudor dynasty because now the Lancasters and the Yorks, they were mixed, they were together, there was peace between them, and that's why the Tudor rose is a combination of the red and the white rose. Also remember again that Queen Elizabeth I, Shakespeare's monarch, was a member of the House of Tudor because because she was the granddaughter of Henry VII. So obviously Shakespeare is going to paint them in a good light. That's context done. Are there any questions so far? Again, I've got Slido on the site, so I'm happy to answer them. But yep, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them up. Now, let's have a look at plot. There's a lot going on with the plot, so let's take a time to get through it. I'm just quickly going to check Slido. No, I've got no questions so far. That's good. Well, I mean, please ask questions, but it seems like we're all on track, which is good. Alright. Give me 1 second. Alright. Got my questions up. I've just got them on the side in case they're coming in and I can answer them as we go. So now let's have a look at the plot. Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, describes his brother Edward III's thoughts. I'm sorry. There's just so much going on there with the ways and the eyes. No, let me start again. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, describes his brother Edward IV's reaccession to the throne after victory in the battle. So the first line, after they've it's like, "'Tis is the winter of a discontent made glorious summer by the son of York." The son of York is Edward IV. He has won the battle. He is the king. It's his victory. And he's in summer, but it's Richard's winter of discontentment. You can see the personification of the weather there to highlight how low Richard is feeling after the battle. This is the plot now. I'm talking in terms of the plot, not the real history. Just pointing that out in case. Now, he's unhappy. He is bored. Since he was born disfigured, people think he's evil. Like, that's the to admit his appearance. Like, his appearance dictates that he is evil to society. Society believes that. Society treats him accordingly, right? So he decides he may as well prove a villain. After the war, everyone is celebrating. You see that in his first soliloquy, like it's a killer soliloquy. Everyone is celebrating. They are together with their partners and everything. Richard is not, because he isn't accepted by society. He's disfigured, and since he can't prove it here, he's going to prove a villain. That's what he puts himself to, because he knows the society isn't going to accept me the way I am. They have problems. I'm not able to. I'm not. Just a question come through. Keep them coming, guys. But anyways, I'm not. Accepted by society. I don't want to be accepted by society at this point, so I'm going to prove a villain. Remember, Richard fought in this war. He did well. He was part of the reason why his brother succeeds, but he's not happy with it. And so he's going to prove a villain. And that, again, him just saying his intentions, making them so clear at the beginning of the play, makes the audience set against him. At no point did Shakespeare want the audience to empathize with him. Like, you aren't supposed to like Richard. And that's the point that he makes with the first soliloquy. And it's interesting. Like, obviously he has soliloquies in his other plays, but you don't see an opening soliloquy like that where it's like, I'm the protagonist, but I'm the villain. watch for me, you know? So, to kick off his evil plans, he schemes to cause trouble between his two brothers. He's got one brother on the throne, one brother in line, and that brother on the throne has two kids. So the first thing he's going to do before he gets to the kids is stir up something between his two brothers. He needs to get rid of the Duke of Clarence. Um, so remember, and I always used to get confused with like all the names and everything. So just quick summary: Edward the Fourth is the king. His the middle brother is George, the Duke of Clarence, and then the youngest brother is Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. They're all dukes, but he's still not happy being a duke. He wants to be the king. So he kicks off his evil plans by causing trouble between Edward the Fourth and George, the Duke of Clarence. How does he do that? Oh, he uses a prophecy to say, and he uses a prophecy, and he goes ahead and tells George that in the play he doesn't do it, but like George comes to know this prophecy that someone with the name G will kill Edward's heir. That someone with the name G will kill Edward's heir. So now it's interesting. When you think of G, immediately the king thought of George, the Duke of Clarence. And that, you know, is that's understandable. So what he does is he goes ahead and gets Clarence arrested. However, George, the Duke of Clarence, does not kill him. Indeed, it's the prophecy will come true, but it's not George, the Duke of Clarence. It's Richard. His name doesn't start with a G, but the Duke of Gloucester. It's Richard who kills him. So ironically, the prophecy does come to the prophecy does come true. However, it's ironic that Richard has stated in a way that it looks like it's George, but it's actually him. Now, I'm gonna quickly jump to looking for Richard, like a quick little thing, because it's quite interesting. Now, this idea of, Duke of Gloucester, Duke of Clarence and everything, it's a bit hard to remember. So what Pacino does in Looking for Richard is when he's playing out the scenes, and remember it's a docudrama, so he enacts the play. So in this scene, what he does is he changes the dialogue. He says, so the prophecy is like, G of Edward's heir, the killer shall be. That's the line. And Pacino changes it in Looking for Richard to say, C, oh my goodness, I've got the line. I think G like sounded better. G of Edward's heir, the killer shall be. So Pacino says, C of Edward's heir, the killer shall be. So he changes the line. And now that's quite significant because for his 20th century audience, because the docudrama was released in 1996, but for his 20th century audience, he changes it. He makes it easy because in the play, everyone calls George Clarence. They don't call him George, they call him Clarence because he's the Duke of Clarence. So to make it easier for his audience to understand, he changes it. He goes, C of Edward's heir, the killer shall be. And he changes this original line from Shakespeare's play. And that is something that you can talk about in terms of how to suit his 20th century context to make people understand a bit easier. Pacino, uses his authorial power to change the to change the line. I apologize. I had another lecture before this, and I think I'm done speaking for today. But anyways, so to change the line, so he does that. That's authorial intrusion. So he changes what Shakespeare has written. But funny thing is, the irony of G, Gloucester, is lost in that translation, and that's something interesting that I personally found very interesting. Okay, now when Richard talks to Clarence, back to Richard III, when Richard talks to Clarence, he pretends to be shocked, He goes, oh God, brother, like he, very brotherly, he feels shocked, and he's like, and Clarence pleads to help him, Richard pleads to help him before revealing to the audience that he's actually going to kill him. Now, obviously, you read this to read this from the play, it's there, right? It's there, and you read it. But when you watch Looking for Richard, this is like a little side. And when you watch it in the like in Looking for Richard, it's so fun to watch, simply because you see the expression, you just see, and that's why I think a good way to sort of, to study Richard III is to read while watching Looking for Richard, or any one of the other like plays on YouTube for Looking for Richard. Sorry, Richard III. That can always help, watching and reading as you're going. But you can see, he's so, and that again, him, Richard III, again talking to the audience, revealing to the audience in this soliloquy that he's going to kill Clarence. That tells you that he's a villain, that he's not supposed to be like he's going to kill his brother. He's playing both ways. Now, what happens next? Meanwhile, so this is a summarized plot. I am summarizing it. You will have to read the whole text to know everything, but I am summarizing, giving you the main points. That's the first bit there. Now, Lady Anne Neville. From the context, we know that Lady Anne Neville was the daughter-in-law of Henry IV and the wife of Edward of Westminster. Now, in the play, Lady of Neville is mourning the death of her father-in-law, Henry IV, the previous king, and of her husband. So in the play, she's mourning the death. She's coming from like their funeral. She's in black. She's crying, and she is cursing their killers. Now, I always find this so funny and ironic. Now, Richard enters, because he's Richard. He's evil. He's going to be at every place. Richard enters and Anne starts attacking him verbally because he is the one who killed the king and her husband. He killed the king and the heir to the throne so that his brother can be the king. So she starts attacking him. She hates him, Now, Richard manages to twist her words. Richard is evil. He's smart. He's cunning. He manages to twist her words. He says, you are without a protection from a husband or a father. I actually killed them for you. He does say that. I killed them for your beauty. And it's funny when you read it, and it's funny when you watch it and Looking for Richard. But he goes, I killed them for you. I love you, whatever. And he seduces Anne into marrying him. You can see the how jarring that can be when you're like, wait, what's happening here? It just happens like this. That's right. It's like one conversation between them, and she's like, all right, I'm gonna marry you. He goes, you're without the protection of a male provider. I'm here for you, but the thing is, I killed them for you. Your beauty is like beyond compare. All of that. Why does he do it? Because he wants a wife. He wants a wife, so that again he can legitimize himself as as a king to the throne. He has a wife, he has a family, he can give an heir, and then that way he can become the next king. So that's why he does it. But she actually falls for it, and he marries, and they marry. Now Queen Margaret, Anne's mother-in-law, don't forget that, Anne's mother-in-law, and Henry VI's widow, she arrives and she curses everyone and warns them about Richard, but no one takes her seriously. She warns them about Richard. She says that he's an evil guy and all of that. No one takes her seriously. In jail, Clarence is having nightmares due to his conscience, right? He's having nightmares. He's a good brother, he thinks, oh my goodness, what if I actually do kill my brother, right? Like, but as that's happening, Richard has hired 2 murderers to go and kill him. Now, King Edward IV, he is sick. He's sick, Clarence is in jail, and King Edward IV dies. Now, think of it this way. King Edward is gone, Clarence is killed. The room for Richard is clean. Richard and his cousin Buckingham have Dorset, Grey, and Wannon, their family and friends of Queen Elizabeth. He has them arrested. So he has them arrested to make sure that now the Queen Elizabeth here that we are talking about is the widow of King Henry IV. It can, like I said, can get confusing, but she is like the one who King Edward IV married. So he has her family arrested so they cannot speak up against what's happening. So she has no one on her side basically. Queen Elizabeth, Henry IV's widow, and the Duchess of York, Richard and Edward IV's mother, seek sanctuary. So Richard's mother is still there. She's still there, and we do get to hear from her, and she absolutely tarnishes her son. Like she says he's evil, talks about the hunchback, and she paints that Richard is really, really evil. She knows that. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. For now, just Richard, Queen Elizabeth, and the Duchess of York, Richard and Edward IV, and Clarence's mother, they seek sanctuary. Now, Prince Edward and the Duke of York, they are Edward's heirs and Richard's nephew. So he's got Prince Edward and the Duke of York. Previously, before Edward IV became the king, he was Edward of York. That's why now his first son is the prince, the second son is the Duke of York. Okay, so Prince Edward and the Duke of York, the two heirs, which in reality, Richard said were illegitimate, but in the play, Richard's nephews are sent to the Tower of London, seemingly as a place to stay safe before Prince Edward's coronation. But of course, Richard is plotting their downfall. Prince Edward, though, at this age, he's like a 12-year-old boy. Okay. Now, Prince Edward, where are we? Richard begins taking actions to present himself as the true heir to the throne with the help of Buckingham. So Buckingham helps him. Dorset, Grey, and Vaughan, the family friends of Queen Elizabeth, Henry IV's widow, they are executed. Although he is a loyal York supporter and a believer that Richard is an honest man, he doesn't believe his friend Stanley when he tried warning him about Richard. So Hastings is too righteous and will not support the idea of Richard becoming king. So Richard and Buckingham stage a situation to accuse him of treachery, and then they execute him. So Hastings is one of the other dukes, like he's one of the other like important influential people in the royal family. They're sitting together and they're thinking about, and you'll see this in Looking Forward to 2, they're sitting together thinking about what is going to happen now. And Richard says, I will be the king while the kids are young. I can be the king. I'm an honest man. But Hastings is too righteous. He does not want that, right? Even though Hastings has already been warned by his friend Stanley that Richard isn't a good man, Hastings still trusts Richard, but he doesn't want Richard to be the king. So seeing that Hastings is an obstacle in the way, Richard also executes him. Richard and Buckingham then spread rumours that Edward IV's children are illegitimate and hence have no claim to the throne. So there's that idea of a bit of reality in it, but you'll see why it's not all of it, because he then kills those kids. But for now, let's just focus on that. Richard is crowned king, but he tells Buckingham he's paranoid that the nephews continue to pose a threat to his reign. So he says, do it. And by do it, he means kill them. So Buckingham now hesitates to support a plan. He is a morally grey character. He has done a lot of killing, but he does not want to kill the two. He does not want to kill the two princes because, slaughtering innocent children is something that has finally crossed his moral boundaries. He's done with it. And because he shows that hesitation, Richard becomes annoyed. Instead, Richard hires Tyrrell to kill the two boys, who are then killed off stage. So he kills the nephews. Again, in history, that part of it is dramatized. Richard still, though, feels insecure. He's the king. He has killed his brother, he's killed one of his brothers, the other one is dead. He's killed his nephews, but he's still insecure. So, and that kind of goes to show that, Richard is still insecure in the play, especially to show that he is not the rightful heir. Like, he's insecure of his own power. And that's to show to his audience. Shakespeare shows to his audience that Richard isn't the right man here. But anyway, so Richard still feels insecure. He calls a prophecy made by Henry VI that Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, will become king. So he recalls that prophecy. He wants to strengthen his claim to the throne, so he plots to orchestrate Anne's death. So he's killing off Anne. who he wooed by telling her that he killed the king and the husband because he liked her. Um, so he kills Anne so he can marry Elizabeth of York instead. And now Elizabeth of York, if you figured by the word York or by the writing there, she is the daughter of Queen Elizabeth and Edward the Fourth's daughter. And Edward the Fourth, and she's also Richard's niece. So Richard had two nephews, one niece, and now he plans to marry the niece so that later on when the niece marries, her husband can't have claim to the throne, and she can't have claim to the throne either because she'll be married to him. So Buckingham now wants to be rewarded for his loyalty. He thought, okay, I didn't kill the kids, but I've still done plenty for Richard. So he wants to be rewarded, but Richard is not in the mood to reward, and he's not in the mood to talk about, and he snaps at Buckingham. Now, disillusioned and worried about how easily Richard can turn on him as well, he finally figured out that Richard is not a guy he can trust. Buckingham decides to flee. Word travels to Richard that Buckingham is actually raising an army against him and that Richmond is gaining support. So now Richard is not very fond of so many Richards and Richmonds. Richard is not very fond of Buckingham, and while at the same time we see that Richmond is raising an army. Queen Elizabeth and the Duchess of York, so remember King Henry IV's wife, the widow whose two sons are killed and whose daughter Richard wants to marry, and the Duchess of York, Richard's mother, they grieve over the deaths of the two princes, and Margaret gloats because her cursed prophecy is coming true. Now remember, Margaret, just go back here and we can just quickly recap who's who because there's a lot going on here and they'll come in useful. Okay, and I did see a question there too. Margaret was the wife of King Henry the Sixth. Okay, so I did see a question about so the wife of King Henry the Fourth is Queen Elizabeth. The wife of King Henry the Sixth, who's a Lancaster, is Margaret. Right. Okay, just making that clear now. So let's go back quickly. Where are we? There we go. Yep, so her curse is coming true. Richard tries to convince Queen Elizabeth to help him woo her daughter Elizabeth of York. Now, Queen Elizabeth, she seemingly agrees, but that's just to buy her time because she knows that the guy has, claimed that her sons are not legitimate. They don't have access to the throne. He's taken them away. She's just buying time here, luckily. She has secretly, though, already agreed for Elizabeth, daughter Elizabeth, the Duchess of York, the last, the legitimate remaining York of Edward and Elizabeth, to marry Richmond. News arrives that Richmond is sailing with fleets of ships to England where he will be joined by Buckingham's forces. So now Richmond is gaining power. Richard suspects Stanley of being disloyal and takes his son hostage as a security measure. So Stanley was one of those guys, he was the friend of Hastings who said that Richard can't be king and then who Richard kills. His fears are well founded because Stanley is actually a secret Richmond supporter. Buckingham is now captured and executed. Richmond bolsters support for his cause and continues marching onwards. He's coming from France, he's coming to England. Richard and his soldiers set up camp at Bosworth Field. Whilst Richmond makes battle preparations and inspires his army by boosting their morale, Richard does not do this. And that again is to show that Richard isn't a good leader. In the middle of the night, ghosts of Richard's victims come and haunt him. So now you can see the biblical allusions here. You can see the theocratic values come into play. They told him to despair and die while encouraging Richmond to live and flourish. And now you see, that difference, the disparity that Shakespeare's trying to paint between Richard and Richmond. Stanley refuses to support Richard, so Richard orders the execution of Stanley's son. However, that is too late to be carried out as the battle is about to begin. Now, Richard and Richmond fight at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richmond kills Richard and is victorious. Stanley takes the crown from Richard's corpse and gives it to Richmond. Richmond announces that he will end the War of Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York to unite the white rose and the red, and he asks God to bless their union and their country. Now, one of the cool things, again, I'll draw upon in terms of looking for Richard and Richard III, is that in looking for Richard, at the end scene where he's showing the fight between Richmond and Richard, um, what happens is in the fight, it's not Richmond that kills Richard. In looking for Richard, in Richard III he does, but in looking for Richard, it's one of the soldiers who kills Richard, and that contextually reflects like the democratic, 20th century values, where it's not the leader, but it's one of the soldiers who kills Richard. So it's like a democratic value behind it as well. So again, just a little thing of interest where we see the comparison where again Pacino has made changes to the play in order to reflect the ideals of his 20th century society. That's the plot done. Now let's look at interpreting the play, then we'll look at character analysis and themes. Again, if you've got any questions, please keep them coming. Again, I'm trying to sort of answer them as we go, but I know that was a lot for plot, but hopefully that made sense. You have the slides available just underneath, like where the video is streaming, if you want to keep them up, pull them up to sort of go through it with me. Cool. So now let's have a look at interpreting the play. So remember, context is so important, right? So we will be looking at context, language, and recurring motifs and symbols. And those are the three things we'll be looking at and using to interpret the plays. This is where you can jot down notes for like analysis and stuff. So, firstly, Queen Elizabeth, Elizabethan era, key context. Remember, Richard III was written in 1592 to 1594, so during that time, and that was during Elizabethan era. Queen Elizabeth I ruled from 1558 to 1603. So there are plays that were written after that. So Shakespeare's last play, The Tempest, was written in the Jacobean era because it was written, I think, just like after Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603. It's quite interesting, the name, because right now, if we still sort of follow this, we're living in the Carolian era, because King Charles is a king. So Charles, like Carolian, just like Elizabeth was Elizabethan. Just a fun fact, I thought that's interesting. But anyways, now, we're focusing on the Elizabethan era. Remember, it's considered to be the golden age of England. There was lots of success for England as they went around and colonized the world. They, people believed that she was responsible for their peace and growing wealth as a nation in spite of the domestic and foreign challenges. Domestic challenges, they had there was the plague, they were having lots of issues at the time, but people thought, she's going overseas, we have there's lots of conquests, we're colonizing other areas, we're finding new places, we're doing really well. During this time, the arts flourished a lot in like a range of areas, including poetry, literature, and theatre. The Elizabethan era and Elizabethan values influence a lot of what Richard III is about, and a lot of Shakespearean plays. So we've got the Tudor myth. Shakespeare legitimizes Elizabeth's reign by villainizing Richard. That's what he's doing here, and there are of course historical inaccuracies there too. And there's a Tudor myth of appearance as well, where he paints Richard to be a hunchback, and and he sort of abides by that myth that appearances dictate personality, and appearances dictate personality. Then politics and religion. So there is inclusion of religious imagery and aphorisms, which reflect the theocracy of Elizabethan England. That is politically correct. Finally, the role of theatre. So play scripts were censored. Queen Elizabeth's Men was a troupe of actors that were formed by Elizabeth's spymaster to spread Protestant and royalist propaganda via theatre. So it's all propaganda. Even the actors, Queen Elizabeth's Men, were propagandists. Like, it's all planned out. And they were also tasked with espionage activities. So, morality plays. They are another contextual influence on Richard III. Popular in the medieval and early Tudor entertainment, these plays are a form of drama that personify abstract qualities. So, they teach moral lessons by, which like equate to, being typically remaining steadfast to the teachings of the church. So it's all about staying within, the what the society considered right, so staying within the boundaries of the church. An important stock character in these plays was the Vice, the devil, whose role was to tempt the everyman, so like the everyday man, the representative of mankind, to succumb to temptations. So Richard III isn't a morality play. It's inspired by it, but it's not a morality play. But he has, of course, drawn concepts from it. Like early Christian morality plays, Richard III provides a warning for the need to be pious and scrupulous by highlighting the punishment with the immoral incur. So Richard, after all his Machiavellian climbing, he dies at the end. The ghosts tell him that he's going to die and suffer. He loses out to the good guy, right? And that again backs those Elizabethan values of of being virtuous and righteous and staying by God, and not and following the representative of God, which is the king. Clear delineation between Richard, who is evil, and Richmond, who is good. So we see the foil there between the two characters. Now, Richard is not a wise character because he's subtle, he's human, he's delicious and manipulative instead of being outright and innately evil. So he plans this whole thing out. The other characters in the text, his brothers, they don't know what's happening. They don't think that he's evil, so there's that subtlety. Hence, he's not a Vice, but he's of course still a Machiavellian character. Remember, the Vice character is flat and one-dimensional embodiment of evil. Richard has motives and he's more complex. The divine right of kings, or God's mandate, is a political and religious doctrine of royal legitimacy. This plays a huge role here. So it asserts that the king derived the authority to rule from the will of God. Any attempt to depose, dethrone, or limit a king's power opposes such will, and it's a sacrilegious act, which of course Richard commits. Only God could deal with an unjust king, so any individual who usurps the throne would be acting against this divine right, which Richard does. He acts against the divine right, and then Shakespeare shows him, getting what he sowed. In the play, Shakespeare reflects this concept as Richard is depicted as a sinful usurper who has wrongfully seized the power against God's will. Now, additionally, another key area of context, we've got determinism. So the notion that all events, including human action and decision, are determined by causes external to the wind, and providentialism, which is a subsection of determinism. It is a belief that all events on earth are controlled by God. And you would see this in all of Shakespeare's play. Like, I think one of the examples that always stick with me is like the lightning in Macbeth, when Macbeth kills King Duncan. You see lightning, you see that idea that nature is upset with Macbeth because he's done the wrong things. That's nature's way of, showing that something bad's gonna happen. So Shakespeare does that a lot in his plays. He does that in Richard III, and we'll talk a lot more about it too. Humanism is a philosophical stance that emphasizes the value of human beings to determine the course of their own lives through the agency of free will. It emphasizes mankind's own capacity for self-determination. So now it's interesting because, we are looking at this tension between providentialism and humanism, where we're saying that, and Shakespeare talks about it, like he shows he shows Richard as a Machiavellian, ambitious man who is determined to seize his fate. And then he shows what happens because he lives in an Elizabethan society. Shakespeare cannot, he does not promote that. But if you are doing Tempest for Moray, which most of you aren't, but I mean there were some of you who are just here for Richard III. But if you do Tempest, what you find is that he actually does talk a lot about humanist concepts. Remember, Tempest was written after Queen Elizabeth's era, after she died. So it's Jacobean play. So I always found that really interesting because when I first came across Tempest, I thought, wow, the man sort of does do like a U-turn, like a 180, and he does sort of actually he kind of does encourage like humanist concepts. But in this play, he doesn't. In this play, we're focusing on providentialism, Elizabethan theocratic values. That's what we're sticking to. So, although Shakespeare's time reflected a more secular fascination with free will, humanism was still viewed as dangerous because it freed men from the embedded religious doctrines and the divine order. And he shows and he shows Richard as that man. Now, key context. Elizabethan era. So remember, the Elizabethans believed that God set out a natural order for everything in the universe. Everything was tied down by fate. This order is known as the Great Chain of Beings. It's a hierarchy. The chain of being prescribed a hierarchy for all matter of life. It was like the kings like the dukes and stuff, and then you had like noblemen, like merchants, and then at the very end you had like normal people. Then you had peasants and stuff. So like it was like a proper hierarchy that was meant to show you your social class. Like you're meant to stick to that. It's a medieval thought. Medieval thought equals to a person. Medieval thought is a person should be medieval. Oh my goodness! Medieval thought was that a person should be satisfied to stay on the level that they are, that they have been placed on by God. Okay, anyone who challenges to the status quo would be met with divine retribution. That is what the Great Chain of Beings says. Now, in the play, Richard's humanist quest to become king is portrayed as a disruption to this chain of being, as he's trying to change his position by vying against the king, by vying against the crown. And this is again an act against natural order. So in Act 1, Scene 2, he says, "O God, which this blood mats, revenge his death. O earth, which this blood drink, revenge his death. Either heaven with lightning strike the murderer dead, or earth gape open and eat him quick." So you can see the theocratic values behind it, that God is going to deal with the murderer. God is going to deal with whoever is going against what he sort of set out. Now, the Wheel of Fortune, a symbol of the unpredictable fate of nature of fate. The wheel belonged to Fortuna, the goddess of fortune, who would spin it at random and change the position of those on wheel. The top of the wheel brings good luck, while the bottom of the wheel is misfortune and tragedy. Now, closely related to the Wheel of Fortune, peripeteia, it's a sudden reversal of fortune or change in circumstances, a shift in the protagonist's situation towards the end of the plot, usually from good to bad, particularly when there are tragedies concerned. Anagnorisis is a profound and crucial realization, a critical, startling discovery, and peripeteia often occurs with or after anagnorisis. Now, in the play, this happens when Richard's fortune takes a plunge for the worse very, very quickly. When he loses both his crown and his life on the same day to Richmond, and that happens after. So you can say the anagnorisis, the anagnorisis after he sees the ghosts in his dream, and then peripeteia happens, and his fortune shifts, and all of a sudden he's got nothing and he's dead. The majority of Richard III is in blank verse with the key language features. Now we've looked at context, now let's have a look at the language features. So the majority of Richard III is in blank verse, with the exception of some areas such as Act 1, Scene 4, where the two murderers use prose when they discuss killing Clarence. Now, for this one, what is the difference between verse and prose? Well, verse is writing with a poetic, syllabic structure. So there's blank verse that still has a meter, but it's not rhymed. Prose is the regular writing style, like how you and I talk. We don't talk in rhyming, we just talk normally. That's prose. And what is quite interesting is in Shakespearean plays, people of higher status are using verse. So we see the whole plays in blank verse because we are talking about, because we've got kings and dukes and queens. They're all, influential people. They're talking in verse. But when we get the two murderers, who this tells us that they're just normal people who Richard has hired to kill his brother, they speak in prose. They speak in normal commoners' language. And that's to highlight the class. Each feat consists of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one. So it's like da dum da dum da dum da dum. So that's in the way they speak. So, for example, in Act 3, Scene 3, he says, I do suspect I have done some offense. So the word do is emphasized by the iambic pentameter, so that rhythm, to reinforce Richard's charade and the self-depreciative effect of his line. So I do suspect I have done some offense. So in the play, Shakespeare also tends to, he likes using the rhyming couplets at the end of the sentence because they effectively evoke that sense of finality. So in Act 1, Scene 1, he says, Clarence still breathes, Edward still lives and reigns. When they're gone, then I must count my gains. Like that finality, that evil sort of, he's the evil villain line. Act 5, Scene 5, he says, now civil wounds are stopped, peace lives again. So, again, if you think of that, it's about promoting Richard as, the um, the bringer of peace and prosperity to England. So now civil wounds are stopped, peace lives again. That she may long live here, God say amen. That she may live long here. And now you hopefully know who she is, which is Queen Elizabeth I. God say amen. Now, remember, rhyming couplets are also effective in emphasizing points that are made by characters. So it makes the line more memorable, it makes the meaning become more accentuated. So, for instance, in Act 5, Scene 5, the ghost of Buckingham, Richard's kind of, BFF, he goes, God and good angels are, this was the quote I was thinking about, I was trying to remember, God and good angels fight on Richmond's side, and Richard falls in height of all his pride. I think it's such a good quote. Like, it really does paint Shakespeare's inherent prejudice towards each, Richard and Richmond. And this is where you can bring in that context and talk about, why is that important? Why is Shakespeare doing this for his Elizabethan audiences? Now, recurring motifs and symbols. So, prophecy, dreams, and omens. Elizabethans believed that dreams had connection to the future and they could be prophetic at times. So, it reinforces the fatalistic, deterministic nature of the play. There are so many prophecies, dreams, omens throughout the play, right? There's the G prophecy, Margaret's curse, her prophecy, Stanley's prophetic dream, Henry IV's prophecy of Richmond becoming the king, and Richard and Richmond's dream of the ghost. Now, another motif or symbol is that women as voice of reason. So we see that while, of course, they're still marginalized by the patriarchal nature of society, Shakespeare empowers the women in the play as a voice of reason and protest, and specifically Margaret and the Duchess of York. So remember, Margaret is wife of King Henry VI, and Duchess of York is the mother of Richard. So they can see through Richard's deception, and they often foreshadow the destruction that he will bring by calling him out. Especially especially his mother. Obviously Margaret does it too, but when you get to the dialogues by the mother, you sort of see that how she again affirms that myth of appearance. She says that he, even though he was in my womb and everything, he's not my son. He's this, that. He's not a good guy. But anyway, so they can see through Richard's deception and they often foreshadow what destruction he's going to bring. They also act as a voice of morality and protest against the immorality of Richard's actions. So in Act 4 and Scene 4, where Elizabeth, Margaret, and Duchess wail about how much they've suffered at the hands of Richard. Now, dichotomy and antithesis. This play is full of dichotomies that evoke dramatic tension through their sheer contrast. So good and evil, and wise and virtue dichotomy. There's also the heaven and hell dichotomy, appearance versus reality, Richard versus Richmond. They also know that, so they're also like so Richmond is like a foil for Richard. The characters in the play also use dichotomies in their lines, like, now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York. Seem a saint when I most seem saint when most I play the devil. Reap the harvest of perpetual peace, but this one bloody trial of sharp war. Now, symbols. Let's look at the boar. So a symbol of Richard, the white boar was his emblem. For example, in Stanley's dreams, Stanley's dream featuring a boar was a warning about Richard. And the people in the play often use those animalistic qualities of Richard's symbol, the boar, as a way to villainize him and likening him to animals. There's that animalistic imagery. So a abortive rooting hog Margaret calls him, the wretched, bloody, usurping boor, Richmond calls him. Now let's look at character analysis. So what is each character doing? The more prominent characters of Shakespeare's King Richard III. Hopefully this table helps. And when you are reading the text or you know rereading it, always you can come back to this, or you can make your own table where it's a lot easier to like identify the prominent characters. So from the House of York, we've got Richard, Clarence, King Edward IV, the Duchess of York, Prince Edward, Duke of York, the boy and the girl. In the House of Lancaster, we've got Queen Margaret by marriage, King Henry VI, Edward of Westminster, and Lady Anne by marriage. Richard's group, his croquets, we've got Buckingham, Catesby, Ratcliffe, and Tyrrell. Elizabeth's group, remember the family and friends that Richard gets killed, like Queen Elizabeth, Dorset, Rivers, Grey, Warren. Richmond's group, Richmond, Stanley, others Hastings. So he was kind of like on his own. And Elizabeth here is, we're talking about the daughter Elizabeth. Now, character analysis. Richard III. So, we've talked a lot about him today. He is depicted as a physically deformed hunchback. The disability mirrors his moral impairment. He's deceptive and irreligious mastermind. He's skilled in creating facades of duplicity and manipulating others into doing what he wants. He's a brilliant actor and he's extremely adept in wordplay. He's not, again, remember, he's not a wise character, but he is a Machiavellian villain who is hell-bent on manipulating the royal court through his humanist actions. Queen Elizabeth, she is the wife of King Edward IV and the mother of Elizabeth of York and the two princes. Unlike Margaret and the Duchess of York, Elizabeth only realizes that Richard is not to be trusted later in the play. So both Margaret and Duchess of York know that Richard is not to be trusted from the beginning, but Elizabeth only realizes it at the end. Well, towards the end. She manages to deceive Richard when he tries asking for her help to woo her daughter Elizabeth of York. Queen Margaret, she is Margaret of Anjou. She is Queen Margaret and is the French widow of the previous king, King Henry VI. She is a Cassandra-like character, someone who accurately predicts the future, but she's ignored by everyone. Has a very sharp tongue. She insults Richard a lot. She is useful in helping Shakespeare fulfill his contextual agenda to promote the Tudor myth and legitimize Queen Elizabeth. She curses everyone and prophesies their downfall in Act 1, Scene 3. Her prophecies come true. Determinism, that's an aspect of determinism. She also sees through Richard and acts as a voice of reason. Then we've got Queen Margaret. Now, this Queen Margaret was the widow of King Henry IV, but the Duchess of York, Queen Margaret, is the mother of Edward, Richard, and Clarence. Like Margaret, the Duchess of York can see through Richard's deception and acts as a voice of reason. She often expresses her disappointment with Richard, ends up cursing him and stating that she should have strangled him when he was in her womb. She does do that. She says that. So Shakespeare uses the Duchess of York to emphasize to the audience just how wild Richard is, and then again adhere to those principles like, nature didn't want him there. Then we've got Buckingham. He is the right-hand man of Richard and is a part of all his schemes and plots until he's killed. However, unlike Richard, he also has a moral limit. He realizes that killing kids he won't do it, but he has killed many others based on what Richard told him to do. He hesitates when Richard expresses his desire to slaughter the two princes. After being treated coldly by Richard, he flees and betrays him, fearing that Richard will turn on him. He's later captured and executed, fulfilling Margaret's curse prophecy. Then we've got Richmond. He is the heir of the Lancastrian claim to the throne, who was raised in exile after his father's death in the previous rebellion. Since Richmond is the grandfather of Shakespeare's ruling monarch, he is portrayed in a highly positive light. Gods and good angels are on Richmond's side. That paints a lot for you. He's a foil character and he's the antithesis of Richard. And Richmond is pious and devout. He's humble, charismatic, and virtuous, the rightful heir to the throne by God. And now we've got the princes. two minor characters, but they're quite important in the sense that they, have claim to the throne. So we've got Prince Edward and the Duke of York are the two sons of Elizabeth Woodville, so Queen Elizabeth, who is the and King Edward the Fourth. Yeah. Now they are precocious and smart. They do not fall for Richard's manipulation to turn them against their mother's allies, so Dorset, River, and Grey. They match Richard's wordplay during their banter in Act 3, Scene 1. However, they ultimately get persuaded to live in the Tower of London, and they end up being murdered on Richard's orders. Shakespeare now consistently uses diction and beautiful imagery when describing the princes in order to accentuate their innocence. So he accentuates the moral depravity of Richard's which accentuates the moral depravity of Richard's actions of slaughtering innocent children. So that again promotes Tudor myth. So Shakespeare uses the murder of the two princes as an atrocity story to fuel his propagandist reputation of Richard. That's character analysis done. So now let's have a look at the themes. Again, if you've got any questions, I'll be answering them very soon. So please feel free to pop them up on Slido. Now, themes. There isn't an exhaustive list, but because a lot of the concerns and ideas are overlapping each other. But broadly speaking, you can look at these big themes, and there will be a lot to talk about underneath them. So there's ambition and determination, manipulation and deceit, justice and order, determinism and humanism, and the power of language. So ambition and determination, when we look at Richard's ambition for the crown, how he's so tenacious that no moral boundary is able to hold him back. He is determined to prove the villain from the very beginning. Every action in the play stems from Richard's ambition of self-determination to become and stay the king. Also note that, Shakespeare's own ambition in promoting his queen's legitimacy and in turn, earning her favour. So again, there's his authorial intent. Now, manipulation and deception. So Richard is a brilliant actor. He's skillful, and he seems a saint when at most play the devil. He is also adept at manipulating others through his words and actions. We can see that in the way he wooed Anne. Other characters also hide their intentions behind false displays, like when Queen Elizabeth says yes to Richard, but she's just trying to delay him. Obviously, her reason is much better than Richard's, but it's still there. So Elizabeth, Stanley, and isn't Shakespeare manipulating the audience into believing the false image of Richard that he is creating? So thinking about that too. Now, justice and order. Richard's humanist actions to become king, they disrupt this natural order and the chain of being. They invokes divine retribution as an act of reckoning, also explored through Christian values of heaven and hell, and repenting sins to seek salvation from eternal damnation. Finally, fate versus free will, determinism and humanism. So are Richard's ambitious actions truly independent, or are they part of some greater course that has already been determined? There's that question of whether he really is doing this on his own, or whether he's part of the, that's his fate. Is his free will an illusory idea that masks the reality of fatalism? And can we contrast Richard's humanist actions with Margaret's prophecies and other deterministic forces in the play? Now, power of language is a big one. Looking at, it's a more niche theme, but it's something that, again, you can look at both looking for Richard and Richard, that you can compare quite nicely across the two of them. So language is used as a vehicle of influence over others. Richard manipulates, he uses his masterful control over wordplay to manipulate others by hiding his intentions. And it's also effective, and also know the effect which Margaret and Shakespeare's language has on our perception of Richard. That's quite important too. Even the Duchess of York, her words have quite an important effect on us too. That's done. So we've looked through the context, we've looked at the plot, we've looked at the how to interpret the play using context, language features, and the recurring motifs and symbols. We've gone through character analysis, and we've looked at the themes. Now, if you've got any questions whatsoever about any of these, anything you want me to go over again, please ask. So that's it in terms of the slide.